Welcome to the Attunement Psychotherapy YouTube channel. Today we're going to embark on a journey into the transformative realm of psychedelic assisted therapy. In this video, we'll delve into the basics of psychedelic assisted therapy, including types of psychedelic medicines, a framework for the process, and what to look for if you want to access this healing modality. So whether you're a curious mind or someone seeking alternative perspectives on healing, join us as we navigate the fascinating intersection of psychedelics and mental health. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as we unravel the mysteries behind this groundbreaking therapeutic approach. So let's open our minds and explore the world of psychedelic-assisted therapy together. So let's start just at the basics. What are psychedelics? So what is the etymology of that word? So psychedelics literally translate to mind manifesting. So you can imagine that a psychedelic medicine is something that's going to manifest your mind, put you in contact with maybe areas or places in your unconscious that you have not had access to thus far. For some of you who are just like totally new to this world, we have what we call traditional psychedelics, which are things like psilocybin, DMT, ayahuasca. The active ingredient in ayahuasca is DMT, mescaline, which is found in cacti, it's peyote, LSD. And then we have non-traditional psychedelics, things like ketamine, MDMA, and ibogaine. There are some distinctions there that you can find online. I'm not going to spend too much time getting into a lot of like the science and the clinical research here. I'm going to be speaking in this video mostly from my anecdotal experience. So the traditional psychedelics are things that have, this is kind of a generalization, but been around longer. They're found in plants. People refer to them as plant medicines, where some of the non-traditional psychedelics are chemical compounds that humans have created that elicit psychedelic experiences. That's not a perfect designation because LSD, a traditional psychedelic, is chemically created, but it kind of falls in that realm of the traditional ones where ketamine and MDMA do not. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the three facets of the psychedelic experience. And again, I'm speaking from my experience, both as a practitioner, a therapist who works with psychedelic medicine, and as a participant who has had my own psychedelic experiences in ceremonial and recreational settings. So let's make a distinction right there between those two things. So we have what people refer to as recreational and recreational use, and then what people refer to as ceremonial use. Ceremonial use are usually rooted in more traditional aspects. So we're drawing from indigenous wisdom when we're looking at ceremonies. Often the thing that's most correlated, the medicine that's most correlated with ceremonial use would be a medicine like ayahuasca, which is a medicine that is very popular in South America, in the Amazon jungle. And there are all kinds of traditions and people who have used psychedelics with their own twist and traditional way of both creating the medicine and administering the medicine. When we're talking about psychedelic assisted therapy, we have to understand that we're now moving what has historically been a ceremonial spiritual medicine into a Western model of medicine and kind of transitioning it into more of a clinical approach. Now, I will say a few things about that. I guess I would put the caveat here of like, there is not a right or wrong way to do this. There are always concerns about kind of appropriating other cultures, traditions, things, and using indigenous wisdom in a way that is not appropriate. And then there's also the argument that this is actually a really good thing, not necessarily appropriation, but to be able to bring these medicines that were traditionally regarded as like spiritual ceremonial processes into a medical model. Now, there are concerns there in terms of where this goes and what people and pharmaceutical companies do with chemical derivatives. But one of the positives here is that we're giving people access to a wider variety of psychiatric care, really. I think what we're going to see over the next few years is that psychedelic medicine actually serves as a huge disruptor for psychiatry in general and challenges a lot of the assumptions that we've had around traditional mental health treatment from the pharmacological perspective. So Again, going back to recreational and ceremonial, ceremonial is usually done very intentionally. There is a lot going into this. There's usually a preparation process. There are things that you're asked to abstain from, or things that you're asked to do leading up to the ceremony. And it becomes this whole encompassing experience. Whereas recreational is kind of a less intentional um, way of indulging in these medicines. And for me, I can think about like being in high school and just kind of not having a lot of intention diving into psychedelic experiences, not really understanding what was going to happen or what I was trying to get out of that. That doesn't mean they didn't have any value, but there's definitely a different approach and intention for either way. I also want to name here that like recreational use, quote unquote, recreational use is like, it's not a bad thing. I meet with a lot of people who are like almost ashamed to say like, oh yeah, I've used these recreationally, because as they're being pulled into the medical model, or we're acknowledging more of ceremonial and intentional use, people kind of create all these ideas around what is right and what is wrong. I think that often, you could take a small dosage of a psychedelic like psilocybin and go hike your favorite trail and have a profoundly connective, empowering experience that, again, like is kind of quote unquote recreational, but still has value. So I don't want to get too hung up in those designations and fall too hard on like one is right and one is wrong. I like to envision them as like two different tools that are appropriate for different purposes and different intentions. I do want to go over kind of the three parts of what I would consider a well-rounded psychedelic experience. And this is falling more into the clinical or ceremonial side of things. So we have three kind of processes, or three parts of this process. We have preparation, we have the actual ceremony, and we have integration. So I'm going to go through all three of these phases and kind of outline. Again, this is from my experience. This is drawn from some indigenous traditions. This is drawn from contemporary medical research, and this is drawn from my experience both facilitating and experiencing psychedelic medicine. So let's talk about preparation. Typically, what's involved in a preparation session is, number one, ironing out intentions. And I want to make a note here because a lot of times people spend an inordinate amount of time getting clear on their intention. And in that process of getting clear, they actually get locked on. And interestingly, it almost becomes a rigid attachment to what they want this journey to be. And then if on the other side of the journey, it doesn't align with their intention, they're left feeling like they missed out or that they did something wrong. Now, I have found in my experience that intention setting is incredibly important. But if I'm doing this for myself or I'm working with a client to set intentions, I always add the caveat that we want to hold these intentions loosely. One of the fundamental challenges of psychedelic experiences is the process of letting go. Psychedelic medicine inevitably will put you into a space of discomfort and unknown. And if you fight that, you will end up in what we sometimes refer to as a loop, which is kind of like going through this cycle over and over and over again and feeling stuck. And usually that means that we're grasping and we're like not allowing the medicine to take hold and to guide it where it wants us to guide, where it wants to guide us. And so one of the things that gets in the way of that is grasping too tightly to an intention. Something that I really highlight in a preparation setting as well is kind of what I just said, is the process and the understanding of letting go. We want to go into these as open as possible because again, when we fight and kind of go against the current, you can kind of imagine like swimming upstream. It's that futile process where you're just like pumping and you're on a treadmill and you're not getting anywhere, instead of kind of reorienting and flowing with that process. So a lot of my preparation is figuring out how can we cultivate the attention and intention and prepare the mind and psyche to let go. We also want to orient ourselves to the possibility of getting uncomfortable. A lot of what I do in my preparation work with clients is I ask them to kind of go into some shadow work, which if you're not familiar with what that is, you can go back to my video from last week. and review that for more of a comprehensive view of what shadow work is. But I'm essentially asking them, like, if this were a quote unquote bad trip, what would you come in contact with? What would come up? And my intention there is to try and prime them to say, like, if this comes up, that's okay. We don't want to go into a journey with the thought or mindset that, like, I have to avoid certain things, because depending on the medicine and the energy of that medicine, it's almost a guarantee that if you're trying to avoid, it's going to pull you into that. And so I like to make all of my participants really conscious of that process. One of the other things that we talk about in preparation is the set and setting. So where are we going to be doing this? What is the facilitation going to look like? Whether that's more ceremonial, whether that's more clinical and medical, or whether, even if I was facilitating more of a recreational type experience, we want to get very clear on what the setting is going to look like so that we understand. We also want to talk a little bit about set, which essentially is the mindset going in, which is what I was speaking about, like getting uncomfortable, trusting the process, being ready to let go, and turning and working with the stream instead of against it. So those are some of the main things that I cover in preparation. Now let's talk about like the actual ceremony or the journey, or what some people refer to as the trip. I try and use language like ceremony and journey. I am inclined to a more ceremonial facilitation. And like I said earlier, there's like traditions that have been around forever. And those are things that are facilitated by what we would probably regard as shamanic practitioners or medicine people who are fully integrated into traditional systems and experiences that I, for one, don't necessarily feel comfortable owning. I kind of think that's stepping into the appropriation realm. But I do facilitate in a ceremonial way that draws on just kind of mythic structures. It's very eclectic, and I'm not honing in on a specific tradition and taking their things, but we are bringing in more of a spiritual type process that allows for what I would regard as a little bit more openness, as opposed to like a kind of a, I don't know, maybe of a more sterile, like medical process. So going into the ceremony or the journey, we're doing a lot of work to just prepare for what we're expecting and what we want to come of this. We're also practicing anchoring in our breath. We are releasing the notions of what a bad trip could be. And in real time, we're kind of coaching and being with the client to allow the process to unfold. I don't think it's a very helpful process to be actively engaged as a facilitator with the participant while they're under the influence of medicine. I think that's injecting my needs, my wants, my biases into the process, where I prefer to step back, hold a safe container, make sure that all the physical needs are met for the client or the participant, but not steer it anyway. Like just having a deep, deep trust that the medicine is going to pull and take the client, the participant, to wherever they're ready to go. Ceremonies are open-ended things. There's a structure and a set and setting to hold it, but we cannot really define before going into it what it's going to look like. It's an exercise in letting go. I've said that a number of times, though, but I want to keep reiterating that. Okay, so now let's talk about like what happens after the ceremony. And this is arguably the most important part of this whole process, and this is integration. Now, if you are tuned into psychedelic communities at all, you have probably seen integration everywhere. Advertisements for integration coaching, advertisements for integration programs, training, yada, yada, yada. I just think there is like so much out there, which is great. It speaks to an opening landscape and an interest in new, different modalities. But I also think it kind of saturates us with a lot of information, and I don't know how much of it is helpful or effective. So I want to make the statement here that integration is broad. It has become such a non-specific term. And if anyone is presenting to you like this is the only way to integrate, I would move away because that is very rigid and short-sighted. I personally haven't come up against anyone who is like speaking about it that way, but it's just something to be aware of. So it's very, very broad. It can look totally different for every person. Now, one of the most one of the hallmarks of a psychedelic experience is that it is quote unquote ineffable, meaning you can't really put words to the experience. So we are taking these medicines and we're going to places that are transpersonal in nature. They're beyond us. They're beyond our understanding. They're tapping us into larger universal energies. They're helping us feel and experience unconditional love. They're putting us in contact with forces of light and creation, and also forces of darkness and destruction. These are archetypal forces that I've talked about before that psychedelic medicine puts us in contact with. So the reason I want to talk about the ineffability is because oftentimes you go into a psychedelic experience. This is an experience I've had with a couple of clients, and they say, "Oh my gosh, I realize that I am just love. I am pure love." Now that's fantastic. That is a beautiful insight to have. But we have to get very clear on what does that even mean? Okay, so if I were working with someone who had that experience and we were trying to integrate that, I would ask them questions like, okay, so you are love. Well, what does that look like on the ground? If you were to embody love in your relationships, what would that look like? What would you be doing? What are you doing now that embodies love? What are you doing now that distances you from love? Okay, how would you show up at work? How would you show up with your partner? How would you show up with your family? Like really drilling down and getting very specific on behavior. Now, I'm not an staunch behavioral therapist, but I have to acknowledge that where the rubber meets the road is behavior. That's the only thing we can actually see. So I treat a process of integration as taking this huge, often transpersonal experience, distilling it down into like this funnel and understanding how would that show up in different behavior. So if you are integrating a psychedelic experience and you've drawn all these insights and you can't figure out what to do with it, that would be my suggestion. Start getting clear on what that would look like. If I looked at you and saw that you were living into this new experience, what would I see? And that will begin to give you a lot of direction in terms of making this a lasting change. Integration is really important because without integration, this just exists as a moment in time. I can't tell you how many people I have seen who are continually going back to the well of psychedelic medicines because they're not achieving the changes that they want. And when I spend time with them and kind of drill down and question them, we find out pretty quickly that they're not taking time to fully integrate psychedelic experiences. I've said this before on different settings and different platforms, but I had a psychedelic experience that absolutely blew me open, completely reoriented me to what I believed about the nature of the world and the universe. And it took me almost 6 years to integrate that experience. I did not touch any psychedelic medicines because of how profoundly intense that was. And I needed that much time to make sense of it. So that's another piece here too. There is no time frame. You could integrate an experience in a weekend. You could integrate an experience in a month, a year, 10 years. You could be integrating an experience for the rest of your life. And you are the only one who can really tap into that and answer that. I see sometimes people get frustrated with themselves too of like, well, I should have figured this out by now. I should have had this integrated, which that alone is just a very arbitrary statement. Like, give yourself permission to be in this process for as long as it takes. So much of this is about being in a process and falling in love with the journey and not getting fixated on the destination. When we get fixated on the destination, I think we stumble because we don't recognize that this is going to call us or put us into contact with every single part of ourselves. And if we want to just say like, well, I want to be this, that's great. That's something to strive for. But we've got to, again, give permission to be in the process. So there are different types of experiences as well. I mean, there are like transpersonal experiences that put you in contact with things archetypal forces way larger than yourself. There are experiences that are more pragmatic, like really insight-based experiences that help make sense of your life. There are experiences that put you in contact with different traumas and events that have happened to you and allow you to be the observer of those experiences, which can be profoundly healing when those are too charged for us to get near, and to kind of be in contact with. We also have experiences that really unlock grief. That is a very common thing I see, especially with ketamine. I work with ketamine regularly in my practice, and oftentimes people go into a ketamine session and just the lid comes off and they just grieve things they never knew they needed to grieve. So that's part of like, I guess that goes into some of the intention setting as well, of like, what are we trying to accomplish here? Is this looking for insight? Is this looking for emotional release? Are we going for the transpersonal oneness type experience? And working with whoever your practitioner is to kind of align the session, the set and setting, and the ceremonial or medical facilitation with that desire. I wanted to put a few things out here for you to look for, if you're interested in psychedelic therapy. Like what would be the questions that I would ask if I were trying to find a person to facilitate for me. So these are some of the things. Like, generally, who is this practitioner? What are their credentials? Are they coming from a medical model? Are they coming from a traditional or an indigenous model? What is their background? Another way of asking that is like, what is their lineage? When we're talking about ancestral medicines, especially one like ayahuasca that is just really skyrocketed in popularity in popular culture, there are a lot of people out there who are facilitating ayahuasca ceremonies who I would regard as incredibly underqualified. And so a question I would always ask someone, especially in the ayahuasca world, is like, what is your lineage? Meaning, who did you learn from? And who did they learn from? And who did they learn from? And what tradition is this ceremony rooted in? And if they can't answer that question, then I personally would say they are underqualified and not ready to be serving that medicine. How much experience do they have with that particular medicine? Are they like, oh yeah, I did a psilocybin ceremony last week and I do ketamine in my therapy practice and I facilitate ayahuasca a couple times a year down in Peru. It's like that eclectic nature. It's okay. I'm not going to say that there's nobody out there who can do that, but generally people have specializations. Every one of these medicines I regard as like a living, breathing entity, essentially. And you get familiar with that entity and you learn how to work with that in some regards. So how long have they been doing it? What is their medicine? And why is that the medicine that has called them and that they're working with? Where do they learn? Where do they get training? What is the set and setting? Like, what is our ceremony going to look like? Where are we going to do it? In as much detail as possible. You want them to be able to outline that while still holding some openness for the medicine to direct it wherever you want to go. How much integration support will they offer you? So after the journey, how much do you have access to them? Are they there to help you make sense of that journey? If something goes wrong and you're left feeling, actually, I want to retract that. Not if something goes wrong, but if you are left feeling a little destabilized afterward, are they going to offer you support? That doesn't mean something went wrong. Feeling destabilized afterwards or dysregulated is very normal. It's a really intense experience, or can be. So are they going to be there to help you integrate that experience? What is their protocol and process for managing crisis? If things do get hairy in there and you are having really intense experiences, you're having, body symptoms, which I don't want to sugarcoat it. These things are possible and normal. And that doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. And it doesn't mean the trip or journey is bad. It just means that it can be intense. So what is their experience with that? How do they manage that? How do they care for the space? What is their relationship to the space? Also, how do they guard and manage their energy? When we go into these psychedelic spaces, we're pulling off some of these psychic layers, these energetic barriers that keep us separate from each other, which is both wonderful and can be intense, because if a person can't manage their energy, if they begin to take on your energy or you begin to take on their energy, and now we have kind of this psychic codependent mess, you can end up in some really confusing places. And so asking questions about like, how do you manage that? Are you aware of that? Do you have any practices to manage your energy, to guard my energy, to guard the space? These are all things that would fall in more of a traditional setting. I think if you went in and asked a doctor or a therapist how they did that, they might look at you like they're crazy, like you're crazy. But to me, that would be an indication that you should get out of there and find somebody who's more aligned with the energetic aspects. That's my bias, and I own that. But that's what I've learned just through my own experiences and being immersed in this world for the last couple of years, both medically and ceremonially. Okay, that's all the information I'm going to throw out there today. That's kind of a broad intro. I'm going to dive a lot deeper into these psychedelic medicines. If you're listening to that end part about guarding energy, what is that? What is this? Or you think I'm just totally crazy for talking about that, that's okay. I will talk more about that. I'll zoom into that a little bit and make sense of that because, quite frankly, we are moving into a psycho-spiritual terrain that many of us are not in contact with in our normal, everyday states of consciousness. So I understand if that's a little bit weird and a little bit confusing. Hopefully you can come back and learn a little bit more. I appreciate you sharing your most valuable resource with me, your attention. I hope to see you next week. Thank you.